Welcome to the Second Reading Podcast from the University of Texas at Austin.
The Republicans were in the Democratic Party because there was only one party.
So I tell people on a regular basis, there is still a land of opportunity in America. It's called Texas.
The problem is, these departures from the Constitution, they have become the norm.
At what point must a female senator raise her hand or her voice to be recognized over the male colleagues in the room?
And welcome back to the Second Reading Podcast. I'm Jim Henson, Director of the Texas Politics Project at the University of Texas at Austin. And we are joining you for the week of October 19th in kind of getting into the final countdown for the election. I'm joined by my colleague Josh Blank, keeper of the calendar and director of the Texas Politics Project at the University of Texas at Austin. And Josh, have you voted yet?
Not yet. I'm waiting. I'm watching the wait times. I'm trying to figure out what is the optimal time in between virtual learning from my son to take him with me.
But you are in capital letters planning your vote.
It's planned. It's planned. I just need to decide an execution time. I
think we need to take it easy on language like execution in the current political climate.
Well, I'm not going to watch the polls. I'm just voting. Just voting. Nothing.
Just going to go cast a vote or two.
That's why I'm bringing my son.
So today, what we thought we would talk about along these lines are attitudes about voting in elections. As if you're listening to this, you probably know that a couple of weeks ago we released the most recent University of Texas Tribune poll, which included among lots of subjects a battery of questions about Texans' expectations about not just who they wanted to win or who they planned on voting for, but about how the election might be executed, what their expectations were about the voting process, where they saw potential problems. And I think, Josh, both you and I, even though this was not our first rodeo with questions like this, were fairly disconcerted with what we found.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, we expanded on a battery that we've asked before. So we've asked questions about election threats, particular situations that people might think are serious problems, or maybe they're little problems, or they're not really problems at all. And there's the sort of thing that you kind of imagine. We ask about, how serious a problem votes being counted inaccurately is, or people voting who are not eligible, or eligible voters being prevented from voting. We talk about misinformation being spread on social media. All is basically potential threats to the election. And we've asked these questions before, so we know, to some degree that, these attitudes that these are problems run pretty rampant. But really, the last time we sort of did this extensively was back during the 2016 election, when we were talking about this a lot. We've done some little half measures in between, and then we sort of rolled out the full battery again. And yeah, I mean, even though we knew that people thought that these things were problems, the magnitude and the intensity of it is kind of amazing. So, again, people could say it's an extremely serious problem, or it's a somewhat serious problem. If we just look at these issues that people are thinking about going to this election, and the share of Texans who say they're extremely serious, 62% of Texans say that misinformation spread on social media is extremely serious. And that's the only sort of bipartisan result. Democrats and Republicans agree about the same rates about that one. Votes being counted inaccurately, 43% of Texans think that is an extremely serious problem. Literally, the votes being inaccurately counted. Nothing about, fraud per se or anything else. We're just talking about, like, can you, say, oh, that's a check for Joe Biden, that's a check for Donald Trump.
Can you count them right?
Can you count, right? 40% think that people voting who are not eligible is going to be an extremely serious problem. 40% also think that eligible voters being prevented from voting is going to be an extremely serious problem. For government election interference, 39% extremely serious. People voting multiple times, 38% of Texans think this is an extremely serious problem, which tells me that a lot of voters have never tried to vote twice. An increase in people voting by mail, 33% said that would be extremely serious. And then people not voting due to COVID, 32% of people thought that would be a serious problem. And that's actually, I think that's in line with other parts of the poll where we ask people, is it safe to vote? And ultimately, I think more than 3/4 of registered voters think it's safe to vote in person at this point. And so that's not surprising. But
although that's gone up.
That's gone up. And part of it is, has that gone up?
June.
Well, and sort of safe how? Safe, like medically safe, and then there's also like safe, like getting your vote counted, right? And so as concern over mail-in voting has gone down, I think the extent to which people think that in-person voting is unsafe is kind of decreasing almost as a justification, but that's another story. So ultimately, the thing that's sort of striking about this, and I think we talked about this, I mean, I've said this to you before, we've asked a bunch of questions about discrimination in the past. It's easy to break these things down and say, well, who's the most discriminated against group, or who do Republicans think is most discriminated against, or who do Democrats think is most discriminated against, or whatever. But ultimately, you look at a battery like that, and you kind of can't come away without thinking like, man, there must be a lot of discrimination going on, because people see it everywhere. And it's sort of the same thing with this in a lot of ways, which is that, it doesn't matter whether you're looking at sort of Republican tropes about, voter fraud, unfounded though they are, or Democratic concerns over voter suppression. Ultimately, it doesn't really matter who you look at. They see problems with the system. Is that right?
Yeah, I think that's right. And I think that what's interesting about this then is that, there's so much structure on a partisan basis here, is that, as you go through that laundry list of all the items that we asked, and, anywhere from basically a third to, a little over 43% think one of those multiple things is a problem. Not everybody thinks the same things are problems. And in fact, in most cases, if members of one party tend to think it's a problem, members of the other party don't. Right. So for Democrats, the big problems are eligible voters being prevented from voting, foreign governments and other bad actors interfering in elections, and people not voting due to the virus. I mean, the range of Democratic belief that those are serious or extremely serious problems ranges from 48 to as high as 57%, and the 57% is foreign governments interfering. But the Republicans cluster around a completely different set of ideas or perceived problems that Democrats don't see as a problem. So 55% of Republicans say that people voting multiple times is an extremely serious problem. Only 18% of Democrats think it's an extremely serious problem. Without going through all the numbers, we'll publish the graphics on our website proximate to the posting of the podcast recording. You see this pattern, as you said, other than the social media threat, throughout this whole battery of questions. And then, interestingly enough, as we talk about independence in almost all of these are almost exactly in the middle. It's almost uncanny when you look at this. I mean, the only thing where in a couple of these counts, independents edge a little bit closer to Republicans, and a couple they edge a little bit closer to Democrats. But overall, independents are kind of scattered across the partisan universe, which A, makes sense to me, and B, tells me that actually the polling is, that our sample is in this battery are working pretty well.
Yeah, I agree with that.
In terms of all of that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think this is sort of one of these really interesting things. Like, and we haven't really talked about it too much in this sense, but as a policy matter, and if you listen to the discussion going on right now, clearly, policymakers could address people's concerns about the election system. And I think what's interesting about this is this isn't really, what's striking to me in some ways now, look, it's not striking because it's political. And I know the answer to why this hasn't happened, but ultimately, what strikes me about this is there's clearly like room for good faith efforts to basically try to improve, the system overall, if you think about it, right? We've sort of talked about this, but if you imagine pairing proposals together, let's say, online voter registration on the one hand with I prefer this one, strict voter ID on the one hand, which we already have in Texas, with the automatic provision of an ID to every registered voter. You could do that and say, hey, look, if you really want to make the process extremely well monitored, why don't you just do that? Right? You could.
We should give some credit to our senior colleague, Brian Jones, who we talked to about that recently and was really promoting that idea, which has been out there. But interestingly, given political culture in the United States and certainly in Texas, you don't hear the suggestion of an official universal voter ID, state-issued voter ID very much, because you get pushback, I think, from the sector of the electorate they're very nervous about federal authority and the idea of, a national ID card.
Yeah, but even a state level, I mean, I think the thing about that is for most of those people, I mean, I agree, there is definitely going to be that resistance, but it's also how is this different from a driver's license or a concealed carry permit for that matter? Ultimately, it's the same information the state already has available to it. So it'd be interesting to see how this goes. I mean, unfortunately, I think for everybody, these attitudes are leading to, I mean, as serious and terrible as these attitudes are, especially again, given that there's very little, well, actually, I'll say almost no systematic evidence of voter fraud. And I would say, to the extent that there's evidence of voter suppression, it's more mixed and a little bit more complicated, I think, to unpack in a short time span here. But ultimately, this isn't even in some ways the worst aspect of the results we found, right?
Yeah, no, it's not. I think probably the most disconcerting piece of this was, when we asked people whether they would trust the effect of the presidential election, and we'll break it down. But, the headline is that when you ask people individually, will you, respondent, trust the result of the presidential election? 60% couldn't simply say yes.
Right. And that's one of those things, like, and maybe, part of me is like thinking to myself, am I getting old? Like, I mean, I feel like I'm, just for our listeners, if you can't tell, Jim is older than me. We sometimes make references to this in the podcast, but I think to myself, is this just like a fact, like a facet of getting older that all of a sudden, like I used to think that doctors knew, like real doctors, not doctors like us, like medical doctors, like they know everything. And then you go and you start getting some medical care and you realize, well, they're doing their best, they're guessing. Right. And I kind of agree. You grow up thinking like, well, we have this election system. It's not perfect, but it works pretty well. And we trust it, better than a lot of other places. Am I just crazy? Like, was I just thinking that because I was a kid, or is this like a drastic change, like from your perspective?
Yeah, no, I mean, we've been talking about eroding faith in the system, and you look at the national numbers, my recollection of that is that if you look at the long time series going back, at least through the mid 60s, early 70s, you see a gradual decline with, a little bit of a bump. But I think it's pretty clear that we are in new territory right now. And the question is, are we passing through something that we're going to come out of, or are we passing into something that we're not? And to me, that is like, I think without a doubt, you can't look at the results we got on this question in which there is a bipartisan, it's interesting, we've been saying that the attitudes that say that social media pose an extremely serious problem for the election were the only thing that there's bipartisan agreement on, but there's also bipartisan agreement on the fact that people aren't going to trust the presidential election. If you break down the number of people that said that they would trust the outcome of the presidential election, regardless of who wins, broken down by party, 45% of Democrats say they'll support it, 39% of Republicans, 33% of independents. And then if you go over and look at the people that outrightly say they're not going to trust it, 11% of Democrats, 15% of independents, 15% of Republicans. So actually, there's not a lot of partisan difference in the erosion of faith in the system. And, I think it's a problem, and I think it's a problem that has reached critical mass. And anecdotally, and we saw this, in another item indirectly when we asked, do you think other Americans will accept the result of the election? And we saw similar results. In addition to that, anecdotally, I'm pretty struck by the number of conversations that I'm having with people in the system, outside the system. Just this morning, people from the diplomatic community from outside of the United States who are asking about whether there's going to be civil unrest in the country in the weeks after the election. And I think that there's a creeping assumption that I think is related to this, that we're going to. And for people of more liberal or progressive sensibilities, there's worry about, militias and activities like that from the far right, going into the cities and taking armed action in response to this. And this is being cultivated, I think, by much of the coverage. But, for conservatives, there's a sense that if Trump wins, liberals and progressives are not going to accept the legitimacy election, and that, and that plugs into pre-existing attitudes about, about the protests and the incidents of, the incidents of violence that we saw, during the summer in the sort of anti-racism protests. And I think this is more widespread than I've seen it. I think it's more widespread in the empirical data, and it's certainly more widespread just anecdotally, particularly among people that are close to the process. And people that are engaged seem very worried about this.
Yeah, listening to you talk about it, it's two things. I mean, one, I think, the more I think about this result and even just sitting here talking about it, it is in some ways, one of the most jarring and maybe one of the most, surprising results we've gotten in this. And it's not just in a couple different ways. I mean, first, listening to you, sort of kind of go back over that, I do think about, on the one hand, this idea, let's say on the right, that Democrats will never accept, Trump's victory. And I mean, it's hard to remember what happened 4 weeks ago, let alone over the last 4 years in some ways. But like, it does go back to a common sort of, I don't know if I want to call it a trope, but I will for now, which is that, basically that's what the impeachment hearings were all about. It was all about Democrats and liberals not accepting the president's legitimate win. I think that argument is coming up again around the Supreme Court, that essentially this is another example of Democrats not accepting, the fact that voters elected Donald Trump and elected a Republican Senate, and it's their will to appoint a Supreme Court justice. And so this is sort of a common, set of understanding. I go back to the other side, and I think, we've talked about this, but, Donald Trump was questioning the integrity of the election process while winning. Yeah. I mean, he won the election and said,
not only while winning, after he won.
After he had won, basically, that, not only was the process rigged before, but after he won, the process was still somehow fraudulent. He would have won by so much more was basically the argument. And, it's one of those things, I think, having been here in Texas for a while and having listening to these arguments about, the election system and voter fraud, it's always been much more active on the right. It's been much more active among Republicans calling to question the integrity of the election system and really highlighting the need for electoral reforms that will, tighten the electoral process in a way that, is being said will increase, the integrity of the process. And so what's so surprising about this, and we've written about this now, but I mean, it's really standing out to me. I mean, what's so surprising about this is not just the 60% of Texas voters who won't accept the results of the election, but now the fact that, faith in the system, long sort of actively being eroded among Republicans by Republicans, is now impacting Democrats. Now, we can't say exactly why that's the case. Is that Donald Trump? Is that years of new laws? I mean, we talked about this before. Is this because after 2013, when the Supreme Court invalidated the part of the Voting Rights Act that allowed states to basically engage in new voter laws and restrictions with less oversight, do Democrats now see this as being sort of Republicans' efforts as, tainting the election system? I don't know, but I think, had I not thought about it real hard, and really, maybe I didn't, the share of Democrats who now look like Republicans on this question is pretty striking.
Yeah. But we, but then we get in this position where, I mean, we haven't done, and I haven't seen statistical analysis on this, but I mean, it's a pretty plausible argument that as Republican, elected officials find fewer impediments because of the invalidation of Section 5 of the Voting Rights Act and Shelby v. Holder, as Republicans, because of that, find themselves, frankly, less impeded because they are literally now without federal oversight when they change election laws, that there have been a fairly sustained pattern of efforts, as you say, in the name of election integrity, to prevent the expansion of the opening up of the voting process to both obstruct any efforts to make it easier to vote and to implement stricter enforcement of laws that exist and to test the boundaries of new laws that, whatever the public rationale, their effect is to make it harder to vote. I mean, if you're reducing the number of places where you can go vote, if you are making it harder to stay registered, if you're making it harder for people to get registered, and down the line, I mean, that has an identifiable effect on, pardon the phrase, the calculus of voting. And I mean, that is what it is.
Yeah, and it's hard.
And if the output is that, we see a lot more, more interest in election and only gradual increases in voter turnout, I mean, the argument is a pretty plausible one. Now, the devil's in the details, but I've not seen a particularly compelling alternative explanation.
Yeah, I mean, just since we're speculating now, I mean, I was looking at some numbers today, and thinking about this upcoming election, and part of, it relates to this conversation, and that, it's hard not to look at sort of what's gone on in Texas, and then this, over the last number of years with respect to voting laws and this set of attitudes, and kind of wonder what the end game is. Because ultimately, if you have ultimately, let's say we're going to keep a democracy. So we're still going to let people vote. And let's say we're still going to try to let most people vote. Okay. Because obviously historically we haven't always done that, but we're kind of at a point now where we're in general, all else equal, you probably have, the opportunity to vote. And part of what you think, if you think about all these laws that Texas has passed, really since 2011 to date, they've been found by trial courts at multiple times to either be overstepping their bounds and either discriminating, basically inadvertently or on purpose. Both have been found at various points in time. So a law could be invalidated because it happens to discriminate.
Discriminatory in either intent or effect, and therefore invalid.
Right. And so ultimately, what Democrats and sort of, the people most concerned about voter suppression, would say is this is basically an attempt to turn away Democratic voters who in most cases are non-white, younger voters for who the process is going to be more challenging for a number of reasons. And it depends on the law, but generally speaking, that would be true. And you go and you look at sort of the preferences of voters in the state. And, part of the problem I think that Republicans are facing, not to say that these laws are 100% politically motivated, but given that politics motivates any law, is that if you look at the under 40 population, you're looking at a largely Democratic population. If you look at the over 40 population, you're looking at a largely Republican population. And that's going over the last couple of election cycles. Similarly, if you're talking about the under 40 population in Texas, you're talking about, a majority non-white population in a state that's becoming majority non-white, or it's already majority non-white, but the electorate is getting increasingly majority non-white. And again, they look like mirror images of each other. If you look at the preferences in our most recent poll of white versus non-white voters for Donald Trump versus Joe Biden on the one hand, and again, for non-white voters for Joe Biden versus Donald Trump, they're mirror images of each other. Since non-white voters are showing much more support for Joe Biden, white voters are showing much more support for Donald Trump. And this also relates to age, it relates to access, it relates to all these things. And ultimately, just as a matter of politics, I don't really see how this helps Republicans beyond a few election cycles, assuming we still have a democracy. Just to,
Yeah. Well, so I think there's two things I think to, kind of footnotes to that in a way. One is that I think one of the advantages of the litigation, all the litigation around this, particularly around redistricting and around voter ID, is that we have a pretty extensive public record of the rationale of map makers and legislators who authored this legislation, in which, because they're going to great lengths to not appear to be racially discriminatory because of the lower bar on that and the tripwires on that is it's illegal.
Right.
Are very quick to admit, no, we weren't doing this for racial reasons. We weren't discriminating. We were just doing it because it's partisan advantage, and that's fine. And that's what we should be doing. So I think that's why when I say, at a certain level, you're only speculating so much when you have a pretty extensive documentary record in which people have been backed into saying, we've done this for partisan advantage. And as I remind my Democratic friends all the time, this didn't start in 2003. No. If you go back to 1990, and I think we've talked about this on this podcast, but it's worth remembering. Go back to 1990 and look at the maps that the Democrats drew to preserve the period of Democratic hegemony in the state when it was already eroding. Democrats were seeing the writing on the wall, and they wrote maps that became textbook illustrations of gerrymandering. I mean, there's just absolutely no doubt about the fact that some of the districts, for example, in the Dallas-Fort Worth area, showed up as examples nationally and well, one, that there's a think tank award for the most, creative, read extreme gerrymandering that the maps that year won. I was just kind of reviewing some of that history for something else. So, this is not just picking on Republicans. It's talking about the fact that we have always had a system in which, as you and I are like broken records on this, election and voting rules are, they're political fair game essentially, but within bounds.
Well,
so the way that I'm thinking about it is, have we somehow passed into a different territory in which the regular rules of the game now have had a corrosive effect over time? And is there anything we can do to reverse that? Because, when I look at, and is this another instance, in which we're asking, say Donald Trump loses and leaves office.
Not loses Texas, but loses the election.
Loses the election overall and leaves office. What are the general attitudes going to be about this among elites and elected officials afterwards? Are we going to double down on this conflict and further the corrosion, or is there going to be some level of macro level systemic awareness that maybe we need to repair some of this? Now, my expectations tend to not be very high for our elected officials, but I also, would like to think that just as we're seeing new lows that are catalyzing a lot of people's thinking about this, that there might be enough out there for people to, for there to be enough people that will meld their self-interest with some kind of systemic interest and address this problem directly. Now, maybe it's not addressable,
Well, I think, you said the word bounds or boundaries a couple of times there. And I think, that's ultimately, there's a couple bounds and boundaries that I think are important here. One, with respect to what you're just saying, ultimately, I think the attitude environment that we're describing here, in which partisans of both sides think the election system is extremely problematic, but think so for different reasons, which has now led, again, partisans of both sides and independents to be weary of the election outcome that we're about to have. Ultimately that has bound, in particular, the governor here in some really notable ways. And ultimately the governor initially said, okay, I'm not going to expand mail-in voting, but I'm going to expand early voting. I'm going to allow you to drop off your mail-in ballot early, right? And basically since then, he has taken incoming fire from his party up until like the minute we're talking still, and will continue to. Because ultimately, given, again, this attitude landscape that's been, really fostered by elites, right? Where, again, Republicans think that voter fraud is a rampant problem throughout the electoral system. You can't, as a Republican elected official, especially an executive elected official, go and then make it easier to vote. Ultimately, that just flies in the face of what your voters believe. Now, how long do they hold on to these attitudes? How long does this continue? as you said, does Donald Trump leave office and all of a sudden, this is over? I don't think so. And I think that's going to make it really challenging, again, especially for Republicans to come to the table for any sort of election reform. And I think Democrats are going to have a hard time trusting the other side and coming together for election reforms. But the other bound I think about, also, as you mentioned, the line crossing, how far we've gone. And you said, it's true. It's total. It's, the courts have ruled it's okay to like make electoral maps based, on partisanship, basically on party. Like, this is politics and we don't touch politics. The problem comes when the parties start to get so sorted by race, and we're not there. But ultimately, when you're talking about, drawing a district based on where all the Democratic voters are, in inner city Dallas, well, you start to talk about race. Ultimately, those two conversations are not separate. And so what I worry about, in a couple of ways is, one, at what point does the political line and the racial line cross, in which we just say, hey, look, these aren't different enough to say that party is a reason to do this. But I also know that what we're talking about then is we're talking about a country which we're kind of, this is sort of the scariest part of this, at the tip of, where, you basically have racially oriented parties. And that's, I don't think that's a good thing, in the sense that, normatively speaking, I think big tent parties, lots of ideas, maybe different assumptions about how society works. That's fine. But ultimately, I think the idea of parties where race is is a big factor in describing who is a member and who is not, and then partisans making, quote unquote partisan laws to affect the process, we're getting somewhere a little scary.
Yeah, and I think that, we've not succeeded in really confronting that, in the legal system, let alone in the legislative system. And we rely, at the state level, as well as at the national level, but focusing on state politics for a minute. I mean, you rely on, the purpose of legislative bodies. One purpose is to adjudicate those kinds of severe differences. Mm-hmm. And we've not been particularly good at that in these kinds of issues, certainly in recent years. And, I wonder if a more competitive system makes it harder or easier to do that.
Yeah, I don't know.
I'm not sure either. I mean, I think, it creates opportunities, but you have to have the right people there, frankly, with leadership skills and a certain perception of risk and understanding of risk and attitude toward risk, I guess, that makes them willing to risk those things. We have not seen that much recently in leadership in the state. I think before we move on too much further with this, let's talk a little bit about early voting before we run out of time. Early voting's the big story, mainly because there's a lot of it.
Yeah.
And people are trying to sort out and figure out what it means, probably prematurely, but that's the game we're in, and that's the environment. But the early voting numbers have been notable, and what are you making of them?
Well, I mean, I think, first and foremost, I'm just looking at, the overall size. I mean, the number of people who voted so far, I think is, I think there's a lot of things that you can do to overinterpret early voting numbers. So I just want to start with something simple, which is, I think after the 2018 election and the turnout we saw, there was a big discussion that was not even a big discussion, but a really insidery discussion that was ongoing that basically said, hey, so are we going to have 10 million votes in 2020? And, it was sort of kind of just out there, not sure. Look, we're going to have 10 million votes.
Yeah.
Let me just say that right now. We're already at probably by today, we're probably around 3 or something. And we still have 2 weeks left of early voting of the election. Beyond that, I'm not really sure how much more there is to say about it. I mean, what you can do is you can go, and people do this and they write reports. You can look inside the numbers. You can see who's voted. You can see what their voting history looks like in the sense of, have they voted in Republican primaries? Have they tended to vote in Democratic primaries? Are they mixed? Have they voted in no primaries? That kind of stuff. And that kind of gives you a little bit of like the tea leaves to start to say like, oh, what are the partisans doing? But the problem with that, of course, is, number one, the main problem with that really is that, one, you don't know anything about the unaffiliated people. We can assume that the people who voted in 4 Democratic primaries are probably voting for Joe Biden. The people who voted in 4 last Republican primaries probably voting for Donald Trump. The third who aren't affiliated in some way, I don't know what they're doing, number one. I mean, I have guesses based on polling, but that's about it. And number two, the partisans approach these things differently, and different voting groups approach electing differently. So I think what we've seen so far is we've seen the hardcore voters turn out in that first week. It's a lot of people who voted in the last 4 Democratic primaries or the last 4 Republican primaries or the last 3. Ultimately, these are people who are going to vote no matter what, right? And so the question now is,
and they're enthusiastic and they're showing up. I mean, a lot of these people showed up like the instant they could.
Yeah, they showed up the instant they could. And so ultimately, is this level going to continue, every week or really, are we seeing
history suggests not?
Probably not, right? I mean, probably what you could say is, hey, whoever would have voted 2 weeks out on the first day of early voting voted 3 weeks out on the first day of early voting. We'll probably see a little bit of tail off. The other thing that we know from our polling is that, more Republicans are planning to vote on election day in person than vote early, whereas Democrats are overwhelmingly planning to vote early or by mail. And so this is going to create, again, a pretty big shift in our understanding once we start to get in actually those election day numbers. So to me, I would say the main takeaway is that, is kind of something that we already knew was going to happen, but maybe I'll reframe it and say, despite the pandemic, I still expect us to see extremely high voter turnout for Texas. Yeah. It'll probably still be below the national average would be my guess. But ultimately, right now, Texas is, from what I've seen, Texas is contributing a huge amount of votes, just even nationally. If you just sort of saying who's voted so far, Texas is really, up there, but it's a big state. So you'd kind of expect
we would expect that given our share of the overall vote. But I think that's right. And I think that we should also give a nod to the data, I mean, that most people are using if they're not crunching the data file themselves. Derek Ryan, Republican consultant from Texas, does, a huge public service that I'm sure is good for his marketing, but I think it can't be worth the time that he puts into us in parsing this data every day. So hat tip to Derek Ryan for his mailing list and the way that, he stays up late and pushes this data out to everybody for free, which is nice. And, I think that as we watch this and we see on one hand, comparable shares of Republicans and Democrats, the composition of the early voting population so far is, as of yesterday per Derek's data, about 30% of the people that turned out were Republicans, about 30 were Democrats, slightly more Republicans than Democrats, but a much larger share of the total that showed up last time have already showed up, suggesting, as you say, we're going to see a lot more voters overall if the pattern is even proximate to what we've seen in the past. So I think you have to expect there's going to be a lot more voters. Yeah,
and I'll just add, for people who aren't aware, ultimately, because this data is available, the campaigns, they know who hasn't voted yet, right? So if someone like, again, Derek Ryan is going and looking and seeing who has voted and what their history is, ultimately, the parties, the candidates, the various organizations that are trying to mobilize voters know who hasn't shown up yet. And so, if they think that you're a reliable Republican or Democratic voter, you're going to be hearing from somebody soon if you haven't already.
Yeah. We should say that, and again, we should, particularly given the discussion that we've had today, this does not mean that anybody knows how you voted, but it is public knowledge if you voted in the past and if you voted yet this time. And so, that this data then, feeds into more voter targeting and, expect to get more texts if you haven't, and those texts will not stop until you vote. So that's maybe another reason. If you're one of the people that's voted a lot in the past and you're sick of getting text messages from all of the campaigns, go vote. And at least some of those will stop. And if they don't stop, you'll know who's not keeping track in terms of candidates and campaigns. So on that, we will call it a day. We will be back next week, yet another week closer to the election. So thanks for listening. Thanks to our production crew in the Liberal Arts Development Studio in the College of Liberal Arts at UT Austin. Thanks to Josh for being here. Thanks again to Derek Ryan for his data. And we'll be back next week for another Second Reading podcast. The Second Reading Podcast is a production of the Texas Politics Project at the University of Texas at Austin.